All right, I think we're ready to start. Hello and welcome. Good afternoon and good morning from wherever you're joining us. I am Valentina, Marketing Manager at 3 Degrees, and would like to warmly welcome you to our first Climate Day. This is a full day of virtual events focused on empowering businesses to take meaningful climate action. The event covers APAC, European, and North American markets, catering to a diverse global audience. The state of the APAC market is the first session of the day. And we're happy to kick off it with our amazing colleagues who will be joining us later. And stay tuned for the rest of the events. If you're not able to join them all, do not worry. We will be recording all of the sessions and sharing those out with you later on. A few housekeeping rules. Please use the chat box Q&A to ask your inquiries. We will have time toward the end to address all of your questions. Also, throughout the session, we will launch 2 polls, so we hope you can have your participation. And again, just a quick reminder that we will be recording the session, so don't worry if you cannot make it to the entire time or to the other events. You will get those too if you registered. Okay, so great. I will now move on to a little bit about 3 Degrees. 3 Degrees is a global climate solutions provider, and we have over 20 years of experience serving customers across the globe. We have offices in Singapore, different countries in Europe and North America, and we are headquartered in North America. And then also, we help them, our customers, through a series of different solutions. One of those is covering environmental commodities, and we help them procuring high-quality renewable energy certificates, carbon credits, and renewable thermal certificates, as well as climate consulting and power purchase agreements. We help them set climate goals and meet their targets. And with that, I would love to introduce our 2 amazing colleagues. Izzat Hamza, he is the APAC lead origination, and Sean Wu, he's our senior commercial lead in APAC. And with that, Sean, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Valentina. Can you hear me well? Good.
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are, right? Hello from Singapore. My name is Sean, and I'll be leading this short little presentation, right, overview of the APAC market. Maybe just a quick introduction about myself and Izzat. Well, I'll kick off first. My name is Sean. I lead all commercial activities in APAC, and in 3 Degrees, we define APAC pretty broadly, right? It ranges from all the way from North Asia, including China, East Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and all the way down to Southeast Asia and even Australia, New Zealand. We do cover a little bit of the Middle East, but so yeah, we'll be happy to talk about any of these countries that you're looking at in terms of your renewable energy procurement. And just in terms of background, I've been in the sustainability space for about at least 7 years now. My background was mostly on petrochemicals. In my case, I was looking after some companies on Jurong Island. How can they move on their decarbonization journey? And that was when I was at EDB, and that's where actually I met Izzat. And then after that, did a few stints in consulting, sustainability consulting, energy consulting, and now find myself here at 3 Degrees. Maybe over to you, Izzat, just a quick introduction.
All right, thanks, Sean, and again, a very warm welcome to all of you today. Again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, or good evening. So Sean's basically shared his role in leading the commercial activities. On my side, I lead the origination activities for 3 Degrees, again, covering the whole of APAC. Just to add on to the region that Sean probably missed out a bit, we also look into South Asia as an area of interest in terms of our origination and our commercial activities. As Sean mentioned, we met each other quite some time back in EDB. For those who don't know, that's the Singapore Economic Development Board, and had a ball of a time there. And here we are, 3 Degrees, driving decarbonization globally. So over to you, Sean.
Right. So I think in terms of the agenda, right, we have quite an action-packed one. So I think to just kind of to kick off the discussion, we really wanted to share a bit of the overview, right, of or just APAC, right? I think APAC is it's not a monolithic region. Many people think it's just one block like the EU, but in this case, actually, it's not, right? It is very diverse with many different unique challenges. So I think we just wanted to kind of set the stage there first, and then after that, we think we just want to focus on a few key markets, right? We just want to spotlight on a few, right, in Southeast Asia. And just really kind of walk through, what are we seeing in the REX market or even the PPA markets, right? So just to give a bit of the flavor of, what kind of regulatory changes are we seeing, policy changes, or even commercial buying behaviors, right? So I think that's just what we intend to cover today. And we'll leave some time for questions and answers. So I would strongly encourage you to put any thoughts or comments you have in the Q&A. We'll be happy to get to those. So maybe just let's first kick it off with a little poll. So Valentina, if you could flash it up. All right. Great. So the question is, in short, right, which aspect of the APAC renewable energy market are you most interested in learning about today, right? This is obviously an open-ended question. You can tip multiple choices, but it'd be great to just kind of understand where we are at with our audiences, right, in terms of their understanding of the market. Maybe just another 20 seconds. All right. Interesting. Market trends and pricing insights. I think that is a leading one. I think, well, is that you have your job cut off for you?
It's not unexpected, right? A bit what we're seeing, the global macro today. I think, again, our beloved audience, it's going to be quite interesting discussion that we can look forward, especially with the interest that we see on market trends. I think we can definitely deep dive a bit more with that slant. What's next what comes at the close second, Sean?
A close second would be the challenges and opportunities in securing renewable energy in APAC, and followed by policy and regulatory developments. I think we will cover a little bit of that in some of our deep dives, right? So I think spot on. So moving on. All right, then. All right, cool. So I think before we actually set the scene, right, maybe I'll just let Izzat, very quickly define, I think, the carbon emissions, right? I think for maybe some of the newer, for companies who are just getting started on their sustainability journey, it feels like an alphabet soup of all these, jargon, right? So I think maybe just to kind of level set everyone, I think maybe Izzat, you just explain what are the two different scopes of carbon.
Right. So if you're familiar with scopes, right, you probably have heard about what's this scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And for those of you who are tasked with accounting or essentially taking stock of the emissions for your organization across the supply chain and so on and so forth, understanding what those scopes mean would be the most basic, I would say, requirement, right? So we look about scope 1, right, that essentially covers your primary stationary emissions, essentially the fuel you use to burn on site. Say if you're running a refinery, right, the amount of gas you use and you combust it on site, that will be your scope 1 emissions. For scope 2, in which this discussion is really going to be covering a lot on, would be the purchased electricity or utilities to run your operations. So essentially, if you're operating assets in Singapore, that would primarily be the purchase of electricity or steam utilities, right? Depends on what kind of operations. Third would be scope 3. In short, it's everything else, right? So broadly, this would be your supply chain related emissions. So emissions attributed towards the purchase of goods and services, emissions towards the logistics that's involved into delivering the goods and services to you, so on and so forth, right? So again, in terms of the instruments that we're talking about, when we talk about market-based instruments that's available today, broadly speaking, when we talk about RECs or PPAs, these are essentially intended to address your scope 2 emissions. Yeah.
So and I think it's very important to find out what is the right instrument, right, to target which scope. Because I think, in my journey, when we talk to some of the corporates, especially the small, medium enterprises, they start to conflate many things or many concepts, right? Is it carbon credits? Is it REC? Or, is it is there such a thing as green gas, right? And I think there's a lot of unpacking and a lot of clarification that's needed, right? So to help you actually really source the right product, to solve the right, kind of a problem statement, right? I think it's very important to get that classification right. And okay, so I think that's on the emissions, and I think just to set the scene again on why APAC, right? APAC, again, as I mentioned, is incredibly diverse, right, in its energy makeup. There are significant variations, I think, in terms of both the energy sources that they use and the consumption patterns, right? But nonetheless, broadly speaking, as a region, as this very big chunk of the world, coal unfortunately still remains the most dominant energy source, right? And I think we know that that's probably the dirtiest fuel from a carbon perspective. And then closely following it is actually, unfortunately, natural gas, which is also a fossil-based fuel, right? But I think what has been very exciting for me is that in the case of APAC, we have seen incredible growth in renewable energy, right? And in this case, I know really big props to, I guess, the likes of China, India, and even Vietnam for aggressively expanding, I guess, the solar, the wind, even the geothermal capacity, right? But then again, even though those countries are growing, I think the very bright spot is Australia, right? They are truly, I think, a real leader in this space, and close to about 50% of their energy supply is from renewable sources, and predominantly actually solar. So I think there's just a bit of that, the variations in the APAC market. And then if we look then not just from an energy use perspective, if we think about from a market, right, a power market perspective, is also very diverse, right? In the case of Australia, India, Japan, Singapore, I think these are what we would call a very liberalized market, where it's honestly it's a free for all, but I think the rules the regulation allows for private corporations to directly contract with even a private utility. But then on the flip side, we also do have some countries that are a bit, well, maybe just beginning their emerging or the liberalization phase. In the case, for example, of Malaysia and Vietnam, which we will kind of deep dive into later, right? So I think it's also a very interesting market from a regulatory perspective. And then if we talk about that second point, right, about why is APAC the battleground for, I think, energy transition? I think fundamentally we recognize that APAC is the world's manufacturing hub, right? I think some very interesting fun facts, about 50% of the global manufacturing output actually comes from APAC, right? Again, they're largely led in China and India, but I think increasingly we're seeing more in Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia. And then we zoom down again into Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia as a region, I think, has been very interesting to me from both a scale perspective, right? Southeast Asia, or the ASEAN bloc, right, is actually a population of about 700 million people. That is incredible, right? Indonesia alone is the fourth largest population, just right behind the US. Vietnam and Philippines, about 120 million people, which is actually just behind Japan, right, at 125. And then Thailand, it's just about the size of the UK, right, on a population basis. And if we look at a geographical on a geographical perspective, right? If you stretch out actually Indonesia horizontally, it's actually wider than the distance from California to New York, right? So I think that really tells you the scale of the challenge that we're facing.
And let's not forget that the kind of demographics we see in the region, right? There's a massive amount of young people and folks entering the workforce, which essentially drives consumption, and which means manufacturing activity and a lot of consumption activity that's happening. And at the same time, this new generation of folks are the one that's actually voting with their dollars, right? Really intending and really wanting to enact change in their respective localities. And so, as to Sean's point, hence APAC is really the hotspot to watch. And I think you put it very nicely, Sean, the battleground for renewables and for energy transition, right? So I think that's really my observation on why I think a lot of eyes onto Asia. And I think some observers in the market are saying that energy transition will make or break based on how Asia Pacific decides its next moves.
Yeah, but which is an interesting point about leadership, right? I think you're saying that APAC will make or break, but we also obviously realize or recognize that APAC is, I guess, in some phases in the sustainability journey, a bit of a follower rather than a leader. But there's a or maybe not an opportunity, right? But maybe it's like, could you maybe share a bit more on, how are the more recent, the US, European regulatory changes affecting APAC?
I think we've got a lot of that questions, and I think many of those, topics are at the top of a lot of people's minds, right? Like, what's going to happen post Trump, right? And I think we can cover two broad strokes around the impact to APAC based on certain geopolitics that's happened. So, firstly, post Trump, with obviously the US making very clear prioritization of us before others, right? I think that's one angle. And to be very specific, say in Indonesia, for example, they've announced the pull-out from the JETP, or the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which was intended to support Indonesia's coal phase-out, right? So they were essentially, or Indonesia was going to be the biggest beneficiary of the JTAP program. So now with the US pulling out, it remains to be answered who is going to take that state, right? I mean, we hear Germany coming in, but at the same time, there's this uncertainty in terms of how concrete those plans are, especially in regards towards decoupling from fossil, right? So that's an example. On the corporate angle, we've seen, I think, both from the financial sector as well as some of the large tech, large MNCs with base headquartered in the US, thinking again about how much they're going to commit towards driving climate action, right? So that's a broad, I would say, risk in terms of the acceleration and the pace in which we see corporate activity happening in APAC. Now, why we talk about APAC, I think the reason is a lot of the managed manufacturing activities and supply chains are all located in APAC. So decisions made from the mothership, so be it US-based headquarters or even European-based headquarters, would have cascading impacts in terms of what's going to happen in Asia. Now, for the EU side, some of you may have heard around the omnibus that was pushed through. In short, the impact around sustainability reporting. So, if you're familiar with another, four alphabet CSRD, or whatever we call it, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, there's been a pullback in terms of the kind of ambition that's been initially set. So, for example, what was initially mandatory reporting in terms of your scope 2 activities, what kind of mitigation measures you're undertaking, now has become a bit more less restrictive, and they've even pushed back some of the timelines in which corporates are required to make those reports. So again, if those MNCs have operations in APAC, that will essentially give a bit of a on the fence kind of decision. Do I remain committed to the path that I have set for myself, being in APAC, understanding all those macro issues, or I'm going to take the lead of my mothership, right? Be it MNCs in Europe or in North America, and then wait for that clarity to happen before taking action. Right.
So, and I think that's a very interesting point, because on the commercial side, when I talk to clients, I have in fact, heard from clients, right, saying that, hey, I'm pausing my procurement that I launched, like 3-4 months ago, because I really need to evaluate whether I need to do it. Am I doing this on a voluntary basis or actually on a compliance basis, right? And so that has been quite interesting. We have, at least I myself have personally seen some corporate pullback in terms of their procurement behaviors, but at the same time, I've also been quite heartened, because some of these same companies come back to us, 1 month later and say, hey, you know what, we have done a review, and in fact, we are going to go ahead to do the right thing. We're going to procure grants or carbon credits or these environmental products, right? So it is, I think, it is a very interesting, market or landscape that we're seeing right now. Hopefully, I think more companies will take firm action moving forward. But I think, but nonetheless, the main point here is that APAC is generally, again, going to be the bulk of where these products will be sourced from and actually and used, right? And okay, so maybe let's just go straight into another poll, right? We have a second question. Valentina, could you pull that up? Right, and so the question is, what is your biggest challenge, I think, when sourcing renewable energy in APAC? Maybe I'll give everyone on the floor 30 seconds, and then we can look at the results. All right. Okay, looking at the results, it seems like understanding regional policies and regulation and pricing and budget constraints. Okay, that is, I think, again, perfectly on what we want to talk what we want to talk about, right? So yeah, I think okay, that's a very great segue into I think our next segment, which is again a deep dive on a few key markets. We have purposefully, I think, selected these countries in Southeast Asia because we see them as each of them having very unique, I think, profiles, right? Yeah, I think some of them are a bit, where more high tech or more data centers are involved, and in some other of these locations, a bit more, I guess, electronic or apparel manufacturing. And in some of these cases, also they are either liberal or a regulated market. So we'll be deep diving into these four markets, and we'll kick it off with Singapore, right? So yeah, I think maybe is that right? We're going to kick us off by what are you seeing as an originator and talking to suppliers on renewable energy? What are you seeing in the market today?
Right. So I think we know for a fact that Singapore is one of the most expensive RECs prices in Asia and probably in I wouldn't stretch to say in the world, but I think it's one of the most highest priced unbundled RECs that we've seen. So over the past say 5 years or so, we've seen prices gradually pick up, right? And obviously the logic is that it's a general, supply constrained market. We are land restricted. There's not much incremental capacity that can be added. There's only so much rooftops you can go, and you've probably heard that the Singapore government are making a lot of plans to unlock alternative renewable options to the market. Things like imports, things like exploring domestic supply of non-solar renewables. So all those things are essentially giving you a sense that there's really not much supply available, and fundamentally causing the unbundled REX prices to be supported. However, I think for those who are actively following the market, you've seen that prices have recently started to soften, right? There are many speculating viewpoints in the market out there. There could be a huge pullback of demand. I think Sean can probably opine a bit more about that because they are looking at something that's a bit more high quality, right? We can discuss more about that. At the same time, on the supply side, we do see many developers coming in to register and issue projects, right? And you'd see some of those data points that we've captured here. Right, so just to give you that sense, broadly, supply tightness, largely because of the physical constraints, demand remains to be firm, but we are subject to certain changes in regulations and policy preferences by our irregular buyers. Now, going into a bit more specifics around market fundamentals, right? We are looking a few, I would say, indicators at best. Again, they are not perfect in terms of giving a signal, but it gives us a bit of a gauge on where the market is. So we look at the IREX redemptions, and for those of you who follow the market closely, most of Singapore RECs are registered under Tigers. So we wouldn't be able, or TIGRS, we wouldn't be able to get the amount of granularity as we would like as compared to that of those issued under IREX. So the information here just gives you a bit of a gauge and trend, right? So IREX redemptions have grown by about 1.5 million units year on year, right? And here's the thing, right? We have to be very aware that the redemptions, while being made in Singapore, does not necessarily give you information on where those RECs come from, right? So you would see top line data saying, oh, how can the redemptions be more than the issuances? But hey, we cannot forget that there are other alternatives in which some of these companies are looking to secure or to purchase unbundled RECs from, say, for example, from Vietnam or Malaysia. But because they are running facilities or having operations in Singapore, they do retire those RECs or cancel those certificates in Singapore, and that gets collected into the redemption information, right? So just to be clear, if you look into the redemption data, it does not necessarily mean that this come from Singapore RECs only, right? So a good one to gauge is the solar IREX issuances. So this gives you a notion of supply that, just in 2024, there was a major jump. I think this just looks at IREX. We're not looking at Tigers. But at the same time, it just gives you a sense of supply, right? So the kind of supply volume that enters the market in a year seems to be very, very positive, right? And that again gives you a bit of sense that supply in at least a shorter time frame in 2024 had been quite healthy, right? And as mentioned, the redemption data doesn't give that granularity how much of it is actually coming from Singapore. So this allows us or gets us to speculate that, hey, there could be a huge interest of corporates that are looking to secure to source for unbundled RECs outside of Singapore. And I think for some of you who are also familiar, you may have heard of this thing called the SS 673 or the Singapore Standard 673 aligned RECs, which allows corporates to purchase RECs from ASEAN, right? So this is again an indication, right? Have you here shown your thoughts about where that is? What kind of corporate interest, especially with the Singapore prices that we see today?
Yeah. And I think maybe before I get into the corporate buying behavior, I think there are a few things I just wanted to note, right? I think an iRec or a Tiger are effectively the same product, right? There's no difference in quality, even they're just different registries, right? So right. I think if you're wondering, are they fundamentally different? No, the answer is they're actually exactly the same. They represent 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy, right? Obviously tied to a specific energy type, right? And in the case of Singapore, I think the bulk of it, the one that are commanding the high prices, in the case of Singapore, generated RECs are solar. As you can imagine, these are considered, I don't say high quality, but just usually the cleanest or the most robust. And then followed by, I guess, the second volume, which is biomass, right? We do have some biomass volumes. Surprisingly, it's trading at a bit of a discount to solar, but again, that is where corporate buying behavior really shapes that pricing, right? There are companies who are, just only looking for solar, but then there are yet some companies who are also, maybe fundamentally okay with a biomass, as long as it has like certain sustainability certification.
That's right.
So I think it's just also quite important, and I think for those who again follow the Singapore market, I think that's been helped, I think, by Google signing a PPA, right, with biomass, certified ISCC biomass as part of their data center load. Right? So I think that is hopefully a good signal to the market that biomass is also a credible and viable kind of a technology type in Singapore. And so maybe in terms of like the buy profiles, I think what we're seeing on corporates is still on-site solar, and on-site solar is actually, I think, the first thing that usually the leading companies or those who actually own assets will try to do first, right? Because I think you can get a very healthy discount on a net metering basis, and it's also obviously good practice, right? You should try to decarbonize as much as possible on your site, and then that is then followed very closely by unbundled EACs, right? And maybe just to a bit of a background, unbundled EACs means that you're just buying a certificate that is not through a PPA, right? Meaning that it's already split, the environmental attributes have been split. And then just on the biggest pot of buyers, I think data centers have been very big. We do have quite a booming, a fairly size industry, right, in Singapore, and followed by, I guess, high-tech manufacturing. So those are like your semiconductors or even like your aeroplane parts, right? We do have quite some of these precision engineering companies that do take on quite a lot of energy. But back to your point about the price, right? So I think a solar rack right now we're seeing, in Singapore dollars, I think upwards about about $90 or 800 sometimes. And as a result of that price, I think it has unfortunately prevented corporates, or at least the small medium enterprises, or even those who are trying to do voluntary action to purchase it when they see that price, right? Because it is probably one of the most expensive or the most expensive in the world. So as a result, I think that has unfortunately stopped a lot of voluntary action. And that's just the way it is. And on terms of PPAs, again, Singapore is a fully liberalized market. But again, a PPA is a very sophisticated contract. It is not a fixed price contract; it's a CFD. Or contract for differences, so it is accounted very differently in your books. So what we usually see is that these are usually for the more sophisticated buyers, right? Or people who have actually, operations, in the US or EU where it's a bit more prevalent, and then they are like, okay, I'm familiar with such a contract, I'm familiar with such a product, I'm happy to do it in Singapore, right? So again, these are the PPAs as it stands today usually go to very high impact or buyers are looking for high impact projects, right? Which is I think I only can probably name a few of them, right? And maybe this is where we should name drop plug ourselves, right? I think at 3 Degrees, I think last year we helped actually one of the leading data centers secure a PPA with Sembcorp, and that is, I think, something that we take a lot of pride in to understand the power markets and to actually source for PPAs in the region, right? So I think maybe that's for Singapore. I mean, any other very thoughts on?
So I think to Sean's point, right, around what kind of options are then available, right? I know there was a question or rather response in the poll that regulations as well as the kind of options that are available, right? So, like Sean mentioned, there are those who are very familiar with the product or very familiar with complex contracts, i.e., PPAs, right? And you have a full organization that's familiar with managing that risk contractually as well as financially. And again, some of these buyers say that, hey, if I have to buy unbundled racks, it's not sufficient to meet my own corporate sustainability ambitions, right? I want to do better than just buying unbundled racks. But at the same time, I don't have the necessary capabilities, in-house expertise, or the budget to fit out a full team to unpack the VPPA aspect of it. So what do I have then, right? So we are then seeing a bit of the basically extracting the best traits of an unbundle at the same time on a VPPA. Again, it's where you are looking at securing longer term unbundled racks with very new CODs, right? Projects that are essentially maybe just in the market for a year or even less than a year, right? And they are intended to be unbundled. At the same time, also you want to be very clear that these projects come from a specific asset, right? So this is where you go into in our nomenclature we call it an EAPA, an Environmental Attribute Purchase Agreement, which essentially goes into a long-term supply of unbundled racks, and you have very clear visibility on where these units come from, right? And in a way, you are able to somewhat link that, hey, because of my intention to secure a longer term as opposed to just buying spot, I'm actually making this project viable, right? So just to be clear, this is still not a VPPA because you are still signing essentially an offtake contract. You're still purchasing the unbundled racks, but you have eyes on where the projects are, right? So that's a step ahead, or a step forward, or one level above when you could consider just buying racks on the spot market, especially when the CODs, or we call online dates of some of these assets are not necessarily very clear, or it just follows a very blanket requirement, say as long as it is less than 15 years. So you could consider looking at something more specific, and you have certain criteria that you want, and they could really be baked into the sourcing strategy, right? So something for you to consider that's an option that 3 Degrees are happy to support you in your journey. And again, whether you think it's going to be unbundled, something that's a bit one level above unbundled, or you want to go all the way on the VPPA, we're happy to have that conversation with you to see what's best suited.
Absolutely. And then I think moving on to Indonesia, Indonesia is, it's very interesting, right? One of the most populous countries, or the most populous country in Southeast Asia. Right. So maybe, Izzat, can you share what are you seeing from in the REX market, right? How are prices changing? What are regulatory changes?
Right. Okay. So I'll start by a very if you're looking at Indonesia, you cannot decouple it from PLN, right? So PLN is your Indonesian National Electricity Company, right? So the idea has been around, if you have a load in Indonesia, you always are thinking, how do I green my electricity supply? Do I buy a certificate from PLN, or do I buy it from IREX? I mean, in general, these are essentially representing the same thing, 1 megawatt hour of renewable electricity. So the question is really around where we see the direction of the Indonesian government going in terms of what they want to accomplish in regards to their RE aspirations, right? So just a quick one on Indonesia's RE plans. You've seen the new president making very bold commitments. I think in COP there was a certain direction in terms of increasing renewable energy capacity, adoption, and also to catalyze the sector broadly. But at the same time, you do see members of the political elite making very contrasting comments, right? Saying that, hey, I would quote very loosely though, it's economic suicide for us to, decouple our dependency on coal, right? Which gives us a sense of where is the direction going, right? So that being said, I think we just have to be very clear, like in Indonesia, there's a lot of, if I may say, a lot of competing interests in terms of how parties in Indonesia would like to monetize their renewable energy attributes, right? So in this case, you would have PLN that we see increasingly taking an active role in the market. So you would basically see we do expect a general decline in the supply of non-PLN material down the road, right? Again, this is the view that we have today, largely because of the proactivity that PLN is making in terms of ensuring that these assets are registered through them and they do hold custody of those racks. However, it doesn't mean that there's no opportunity if you're looking for material, right? There would be other options, say geothermal and hydro assets that are relatively new, right? To our knowledge, that these remain to be available under the IREX issued unbundled rights, right? So that remains to be an option for you to consider. Now, just look into some of the fundamentals in terms of the redemption growth, right? Year on year, we've seen about 500,000 units being redeemed, right? So it just shows that there is a gradual demand, a strong growth in the requirements of this product. Again, this does not highlight the tigers, which is where PLN has used as a basis of them issuing their PLN REC. So this is just not the full picture, but it gives you a good trend, a good sense of where the trend is. Right. So in terms of demand, we see that there's a broad demand growth. We see supply to be stagnated largely because there's this competing interest, right? So you have state-owned activities happening to onboard those volumes and on a net basis, from what we see on just IREX, it's a bit more of a plateau, right? So what it gives you is, if demand is good and supply is flat, prices are just going to go one direction, right? So that's where we are seeing that to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's we share a bit about some of what the prices. I mean, just even broad ranges
cool.
that we're seeing in Indonesia.
Right. So I would split it broadly into two categories. So you have your geothermal and hydro. They are trading around, $1 to about $180. It really depends on the vintage, the time of the year, but that's what we see traded generally. For the solar, which again we see to be beginning to be less available down the road, right? We have seen market trading between $3.50 all the way to $4.50 over the past 12 months.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about corporate, I know we have two other countries that I want to really get to, but I think one insight from me is that we're starting to see some companies actually be quite discerning on where actually the REC is from,
Yes,
right?
yes.
As you may know, I think Indonesia is made up of many different islands, and in fact, what we have heard from some clients is that they're now looking for specific RECs that come from, say, like the Java island, right? And that has obviously created a bit of a bifurcated market, right? Because now there are people sourcing from very specific locations of assets, and then they again command a higher price, right? So there's a bit of that dynamic that's going on. But again, from a best practices perspective, actually, as long as it's within a geographical boundary, I think RE100 actually accepts them, right? So again, what we're seeing is again some customers a bit more sophisticated or more ambitious in their procurement strategies. So moving on to the next one, which is, I guess, Malaysia, right across the border from us, right? Maybe I'll just start off with what, in terms of the corporates, we're seeing, right? Fundamentally, I think Malaysia is still going to be driven by, manufacturing, right? Electronic manufacturing and big tech, right? They do have a lot of semiconductor chips manufacturing, even appliances manufacturing, right? A huge driver of their industrial base. And I think also what we noticed quite interestingly is some of the financial institutions, right? And I really have to applaud them. I think Maybank, Hong Leong, some of these guys, they have come up with very bold statements that they want to decarbonize their portfolios, and they have actually been quite a big buyers of these RECs. Or no, actually not just RECs, but sometimes across other environmental products. And I think in the case of Malaysia, I think over the last, I guess, 3-4 years, is that we start to see an opening up of their power markets. It was previously, I guess, almost like closed, right? It's a regulated market. But with the introduction, I guess, of the CREST program, and I guess the GT, the Green Energy Tariff, it is, I think, more options for corporates to resource green power, right? Again, the question is then, is it more cost effective? I go one route or the other. But again, that is, the options are available. And I think just one thing to note is, we've heard a lot of talk about data centers coming online. Johor especially, right? We're going to see what the latest news, 46 applications approved. So I think that would be a huge energy suck. And there are actually corporate clients of mine that are saying, hey, should I be worried? Should I be making a decision now to procure, right? So anyway, that's just a bit of what we're seeing in Malaysia. But maybe very quickly, can you share more about prices, regulations again, what we see?
Yeah, so I think thanks, Sean, mentioned about the whole data center demand in Malaysia. I think the total additional capacity in the pipeline is about 1.1 gigawatt of installed capacity, which is massive by invasion, right? So I think that ties up to regulation, because the idea here is around how does regulations keep up with some of these new load that comes online, and whether the country is ready from an infrastructure standpoint as well from a regulatory standpoint, and also not to deprioritize other industries that are already operating there. Yeah? So that's why you'd see some of these programs coming up, like CREST. Essentially, it's like a VPPA scheme that the state that the country has implemented. That we see very mixed views. I think we're very candid around the uptake of it. I think there are many debates, many concerns around whether this is most cost effective. So from our side, our point of view on the supply side, I think there remains to be still an opportunity on the unbundled stuff. I think the same arguments, the same perspectives as what we mentioned in the Singapore piece, right? So the maturity of the customers may not necessarily be able to undertake CREST. At the same time, there's a lot of regulatory hurdles to unpack. And I think the main observation we see both on the seller side as well as on the buyer side is whether they are both ready to engage in a long-term contract where energy prices are still volatile, right? So if you are there going to be, a data center load that's going to be there for 20, 30 years, it makes sense to just lock in your prices. But if you're going to be something that's managing your OPEX on a more, semi-regular basis, right? That's something that you need to weigh, right? So if you look at just Malaysia unbundled REX prices, I think one observation we've seen is because of some of these favorable government policies to encourage adoption of RE, a lot of capacities have been added. Right? So we do not see a situation where there will be a decline in renewable energy supply in the country, right? And we also need to, we cannot fail to remember that Malaysia has both an eastern side and a western side, right? So you have Peninsular Malaysia that has been a lot of the focus of the conversation, but you also have East Malaysia, which has many hydro assets, right? So if you're here coming to purchase your renewable energy certificates, you have a huge option to consider, a huge series of options. You have your large hydro, you have your small hydro, you have solar, you have biomass, and even biogas as options to consider, right? And it really goes back down towards what's your comfort level, what kind of sustainability benchmarks and metrics you intend to benchmark your organizations with. Is it RE100? Is it something that you have internally that you want to adhere to? And then there are a suitable product for you to consider, right? So just talk about pricing. I think where you see the entry point of REX in Malaysia would be your large hydro. Again, it's an economies of scale kind of thing. You have those mega hydro dams that's been set up for quite some time, and they're issuing REX close to $1.50, right? Then you just go up that pecking order. You have something that's in the biomass range, right? So the biomass includes biogas. You have something that's close to the $2 mark, right? And as you go up to something that where most participants are a bit more excited about, which is solar, and that becomes a bit of that golden ticket, right? Everyone wants to attain, and that's trading close to about maybe between $4 to $5.50 for the past year. Huge volatility. I think there's been this whole contest between demand and supply, right? A lot of these projects, when they enter the market, are anticipating demand coming in from the data center load, but they fail to realize that most of the data centers are actually connecting their power through the CREST systems or through other options and may not be looking at unbundled. Right? So what happens is there had been a huge beat up of prices, but towards the second half of 2024, we see prices soften a bit. I think that's the reason because the demand being material starts to be in question, right? Some of this demand actually didn't materialize. At the same time, we see a lot more supply coming to market, especially on the East Malaysia side. We do see huge potential capacities coming up, although this is not in place now. But again, we see the market trading with a forward view in mind. Hence, buying demand is actually softening towards that and pulling down the prices. Right. So that's a bit of where we see. So general view on the market, we hold a view that I think the market will remain to be, the market would generally become an oversupplied market, right? I think initially there was some concerns in the early half of 24 that, hey, market's tight, there's not enough solar, there's a bit of a contest. But I think from a macro and fundamental standpoint, we do see the market to be well supplied, right? And the question remains to be really where do the demand align themselves with in terms of what they want to buy on the unbundled side.
Interesting. And I think that leads us to our last country, which is Vietnam. And I think Vietnam's a very interesting one, right? Because I think when you talk about prices in the other three countries, right, in the case of Singapore, $90-100, then in the case of Malaysia, $1 and above. And when you talk about Vietnam, you are seeing a very interesting pricing on their REX, right? And maybe you can just talk more about their pricing.
So I think for those of you who know the market, you know where the prices are. But for Vietnam, we do see prices go as low as 20 cents to the dollar. So it just gives a sense, right? what it means where the value of a rep gets that low is because of the oversupply in the market, right? And it goes back into where there was a huge push by the government to actually allow for huge projects to be developed, right? Essentially flooding the grid with renewables, which is again, if you are looking at a broader energy transition story, this is perfect because it means renewables are so cheap, and in fact, it's cheaper than sometimes brown power in that case. Hence, it is a no-brainer to actually secure, your green option for power, right? So yeah, just to go into the fundamentals, we do see huge supply available in Vietnam, and obviously that means buyers are able to pick and choose the kind of projects they want, right? If you remember earlier on, we talked about going one step higher. I want to have a higher quality project, if I may, but not go into a VPPA kind of conversation. So we do see some conversations on sellers offering, long-term. When I talk about long-term, it's 5 to 10 years supply of unbundled racks from a named project or a portfolio of named projects, right? So this gives some surety and confidence to the buyer that, hey, I'm actually contributing to the additional development of new projects and not just buying the cheapest one in the market.
And yeah, I think in terms of the corporate activity, I think it's again largely driven by a huge industrial base on electronic manufacturing. I think for those with assets, I think you know the likes of Samsung, LG, huge, right? And then now with even VinFast there also, it's going to be they've been quite a big procurement of such renewable energy, right? And so that's I think one of the big chunk. The second biggest chunk is actually apparel manufacturing, right? So you can imagine a lot of textile, which is actually very heavy in terms of their maybe not a bit of electricity, but actually a lot of water usage, which is quite interesting. Separate topic, but a huge actually suck right on resources. And I think, but what's underpinning it, or what is or a new change that we're seeing in the Vietnam market is, I think last year they have announced their DPPA scheme, which is effectively a direct PPA program that's run by the government utility. It's been announced, but unfortunately, I think details are a bit sparse. Some of the cost factors that that are in that equation is actually still even unspecified, right? But as a result of that scheme being announced, I think what we have seen is some corporates saying, "Oh, okay, wait, maybe let me wait for that regulation or wait for that program to come out and then evaluate it, on an apples to apples basis." So yeah, I think that's what we're seeing in the market right now. Either you go down the unbundled route or really you wait and see for a DPPA route, at least in Vietnam. Right. So, but I think and I want to leave some time for questions, but I think just to wrap it all up here, right, in APAC, I think the key point here is that these are all very different markets, very diverse markets with very different intricacies, right, in the economics, right. I mean, again, some of you on the call might be interested in how is like the Asian power grid going to affect prices. What happens if we heard about Singapore government working with I think it's the RE100 on allowing cross-border rack trading. How about energy imports? How would that affect the economics, right? And that's precisely I think what's very exciting. I mean, even if I can't look, my crystal ball is as hazy as I think it's the next person, right? But fundamentally, I think that's why it is such a unique market for us to operate in. Very different actors, very different languages, and very different reasons for going down these compliance schemes, right? So I think, but with that said, I think 2 degrees in not just APAC, but I think 2 degrees globally is happy to help you on that journey to even just unpack, right? What is the right product? What are the right claims you can make on some of these solutions that you're looking for, right? So I think I'm going to leave some time up, or maybe just maybe it's why don't you take us back right on key takeaways?
Cool. So I would summarize some of our discussions today to 3 broad points, and you can see on the slide there you have the demand aspect of it, you have supply, and of course you have regulatory issues that underpin the whole market, right? So on demand, I think like what Sean mentioned, there's this whole push around looking at variable options, right? So you have the bundle and unbundled mix, right? So this really goes into what a corporate procurement strategy is. I don't think that it's a one size fits all, but at the same time there are different considerations that you need to take, right? So we also shared that in APAC especially, you have a lot of I would say derived demand kind of conversation, because a lot of the activities in APAC is actually serving the large HQ, European and American HQ, and given the global macro that happens, the supply chain in APAC is on a wait and see. So we remain to be very closely engaging with our market participants to see what is the next move in this regard. Of course, as I mentioned, there's a lot of supplier activities in APAC, so that remains to be a very important discussion to be had with your suppliers, right? If you are in an organization with many suppliers in APAC, I think it's also a good time to have that conversation with them. Again, from what we are also not trying to imply here, but prices seems to be a very attractive point to actually enter and make some purchases. So happy to have that chat with you if you are keen to take action in that regard. Right. I think last point on demand is we see a long-term procurement contract being discussed. Again, still unbundled, but if there's a push towards something better than just buying unbundled spot market basis, you want something that you are able to explain, saying this is really a better project than just buying from the market without knowing where it's coming from. We can have a discussion with you to really look into securing long-term offtake of unbundled rights, but from a project that you're very familiar and aware of. So that's the demand takeaways. Now on supply, I think generally in Asia Pacific, we see a broad increase of available supply, right? Of course, Singapore remains to be the one where we have to observe what options are in the market, but in general, we don't think that the market will be short of supply in the near term. And at the same time, an observation across some of these markets that we cover, there's a lot of activity or rather proactivity rather by the state-owned entities, right? Be it in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in places like Taiwan, even where they want to actually hold a bit of the attributes inward, right? I think this is definitely to hedge them against global risks. As you can see, global macro has impacted the market. So a lot of this, I would say, supply and demand being contested with some of these local entities that want to hold custody of the rights. So that's an area to watch that could really help and that could really impact how prices move in the short to medium term. And lastly, regulations. I think like what Sean mentioned, I wouldn't repeat the points. There are a lot of topics happening, ASEAN Power Grid, cross-border recognition of RECs. At the same time, different alternatives to RECs. I think that's something that we can definitely have a different conversation altogether, but you have conversations of domestic generated, geothermal in Singapore, right? And I think if you've caught the news during the budget debate not too long back, there was an announcement around looking at whether nuclear could be a way it could generate, renewable energy for the country. So topics like this could impact certain expectations on price and availability. So it's something to also keep a close watch on. Again, I think just one point for me that what we've seen today is there's a lot of push towards attaining the best in class, right? So what we've learned in regards towards energy transition and sustainability is that let's not let perfection be the enemy of good. Right? I think that's the main message. There are good options available, and if you want to be a bit better than that, they are available. And just let's just not stop taking action, especially in this dire situation that we need everyone in the room, everyone out there to just do our part and just make that commitment.
Yeah, effectively an all oars in the sea kind of situation.
Right, that's right.
And I think one thing also I just may want to chime in very quickly before we go to questions is on supply chain engagement, right? I think that's a big part of the work we do, right? I mean, some of our clients who have huge loads in Southeast Asia, and then they're asking, how do I strategize and how do I decarbonize my supply chain, right? We do have actually a very cool software tool called Supplier Reach. I would encourage you to check it out. It helps effectively, what we call mothership or queen bee company, onboard their suppliers and track, what are their energy usage and what are solutions out there, right? So I think I'm going to leave with that last point here. So maybe Valentina, over to you, right? What are some of the questions we're seeing, that Izzat and myself can take?
Yes, so we do have a few questions, but only 4 minutes left. So let's try to answer those. The first one is, are there REC carbon offset opportunities in the Philippines?
So if you repeat the question again, Valentina?
Are there REC and carbon offset opportunities in the Philippines?
Okay, good question. We definitely do not have the full time to answer. The short answer is yes, but it comes with a lot of caveats, right? If I may, it really boils down towards whether you are looking for RECs that meet RE100 eligibility or not. Today, we do have RECs available, but they come from primarily geothermal and hydro sources. And in the Philippines, most of these assets are quite old, right? So it remains to be seen whether solar assets can be issued under either IREC or Tiger's Head, but that's a conversation that's currently being had with the regulations.
So I think just very quickly on my end, I think in the case of Philippines, what we have, or at least I've seen some of my clients do is then they recognize that there's a shortage of like solar, and then they say, you know what, I'll just pick the next best option,
Yes.
NBO, right? And that's where I guess things like Izzat's what he was mentioning about, maybe older assets. We have clients taking them up, but again, these are on a very voluntary basis, and they fully recognize the next best option, right? Yeah. So
Great. We only have 3 minutes left. This might require follow-up, but there is another one saying, do you have information or additional sourcing options about South Korea? Local Korean certificates are very expensive. And also, as a follow-up, are there to South Korea, are there other cross-border sourcing options possible for South Korea?
Oh, that's a tricky one. So maybe I'll give it a go again. So I think so first and foremost, it really depends on what standards or why you are taking that action, right? I think if you are trying to cater to RE100 or I guess RE100 is the main one. Based on that framework, I think unfortunately supply is quite short, right? I don't think there are that many recs. I mean, Korea has obviously, the government has changed some of their regulations and issuances on recs. So supply is obviously, just kind of like vanished, right? So with that said, honestly, so if you're going down the compliance route of, well, not compliance, but RE100 route, I don't think there are that many solutions. But if you're really going on a voluntary basis, I believe there might be some volumes out there. But again, you have to be very flexible on the vintages or the tech type or where it comes from, right? So unfortunately for Korea, it's just a bit of a difficult market to kind of.
So I think just to add on that, I think the Korean market is very similar to what we see in the Japanese market, where you have to be, participants need to actually be in the country in terms of even the likes of a trader or a service provider. You have to be registered within the country, and the registry is actually, or the domestic marketplace is managed by the state, right? So there are a lot of intricacies there. So a lot of times they do have interest around Korean volumes. They do firstly look into, can we get direct sourcing from PPAs? Otherwise, unbundled, it goes into this whole marketplace that the state offers. If not, then they will adopt the next best option, right? Which in this case could be, the close proximity or, some of these assets. Let's just give an example, the data center that's got a load in Korea, but they've also got a load in Thailand. They say, you know what, for the purpose of us showing our intent to decarbonize our overall operations, they do buy the Thailand volumes to meet their Korean requirements. And what they do is to be very explicit about that in their sustainability reports.
And I think just a very quick one. I think in terms of then one part of the question is on alternatives, right? And well, in the case of I think Korea, there is a program. I think they're called the Green Premium Program, or GPP, if I'm not wrong. I think corporates can pay effectively a green premium, like a green tariff, right? To recognize their load as renewable energy. So there's effectively a feed-in tariff kind of program, green tariff program that's available. But that is something that has to be contracted directly with CAPCO. Unfortunately, that's right.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Izzat and Sean. We are at time, and there are more questions, but we can follow up on those questions after the session. Thank you all for joining us today. Please stay tuned for the rest of the sessions. There's another one coming up in an hour for Europe. So please shout out with questions, and thank you again. Thank you, Izzat and Sean. Bye-bye.
Thank you. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A. We'll try to get to you, right, on an email basis.
Will do.
All right. Cheers. Thank you.
Bye.